So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the sort of knowledge base, the structural starting point for this, which is this preliminary ontology. And Susan has mentioned, you probably all know, or perhaps most of you know what an ontology is. It's a formal data structure that a computer can use to represent information, represent knowledge in terms of a defined set of constructs and their attributes and the relationships between them. And that's the key, because the way that we express ourselves in natural language leaves too much ambiguity for us to be able to use these kinds of automated processes to work with. And as Susan has said, what we're trying to do with this ontology is to answer what you might call as the big question in behavior change. What works, compared with what, how well, with what degree of exposure, for whom, in what settings, with what behaviors, and why. And what I'm going to do is just unpack that a little bit so that you can see exactly what we're talking about. So when we're saying what, as in what works, we're always talking about an intervention versus a comparator, because whenever we're looking at cause and effect, there's always a counterfactual. And that's really important because, as you will know if you're ever involved in any intervention studies, without a comparator, you don't know what would have happened otherwise. In any case, there is no otherwise. In a general sense, there's only an otherwise. What else would you have done? So we do placebo-controlled studies, we do studies against usual care, we use studies against brief advice, and so on. So the intervention and comparator are critical. They're at the heart of this. So we need to be able to identify the content of the intervention and the way it's delivered, because both of those will be important. We need to be able to capture exposure, which we can think of in terms of the reach of the intervention. That's to say, to what extent does the intervention actually even get into the same universe as the person? So, for example, if you design an app which only works on an iPhone and people don't have an iPhone, then it's not going to reach people who don't have an iPhone. But then there's also engagement, which is the user-defined, user-driven part of it, which is the extent to which the person or people, the population that you're interested in, are using or engaging with the intervention that you're proposing. The population is absolutely critical in terms of its characteristics. Whose behavior are we trying to change? There are issues, for example, around are we talking about pregnant people? Are we talking about people with mental health problems? In the case of smoking cessation, for example, how important is it, what the level of nicotine dependence is, what their family circumstances are, and so on. So we need to be able to characterize that population in ways that make a difference to the way that the intervention, or the effectiveness of the intervention. But we also need to take account of the setting, the culture in which the intervention is being delivered. In a smoking cessation intervention, for example, let's say brief advice for smoking cessation, you're going to have a different effect in a culture where there's never been any, or there's very little tobacco control going on, so that when a GP or a physician or a health professional of some sort says, you know, smoking is really bad for you, I think you should stop smoking, this is what will happen if you don't, it's actually news to that person. Whereas in a culture with a very strong tobacco control climate, then the impact is going to be potentially considerably less. So setting is really important. We want to know how the interventions work, because if we don't do that, we're constantly playing 20 questions with nature, as has been famously put. Because unless we have a theory or a model underpinning the way that an intervention has an effect on something, when we come to a new situation, we have no basis for extrapolating into that new situation. And given the infinite variety of contexts, populations, and ways that interventions are delivered, then we're always going to be having to do yet another study to find out whether something worked or not. And then, of course, finally, but very importantly, we have the behavior itself. Different behaviors have different characteristics. Some behaviors involve stopping things, and some involve starting things. Some involve areas of dependence or motivational problems, some involve problems of cognitive capacity. So we need to understand what the behaviours are. So this is the challenge, and you can see why we have decided to focus on a specific use case, primarily smoking cessation. It's an area where there is a very large evidence base. We have good hard outcome measures with biochemically verified abstinence rates, but even then it's going to be pretty challenging. This is the version 1 of the top level of the ontology expressed in diagrammatic form, and I won't go into detail about it. There's plenty of opportunity to study this later if you haven't already seen it. But what it does is it represents what we think are the top level influences that occur within the system. And the reason why effect, which is at the top there, is coming out of the whole of the blue bit of the pyramid, or the iceberg, depending on how you look at it, is because the effect is associated with the whole of that system. The effect is not a property of the intervention, it's not a property of the behaviour, it's not a property of exposure or any of the individual elements within the system. The effect size is a property of the system as a whole. So when we extract information from individual studies, what we'll be doing is collecting all those features together and then associating all those features with an effect size. So that's the key idea. Fortunately for us, there are many examples of ontologies out there, and we're not going to be starting from scratch in creating ontologies. And in fact, we are proposing to draw very heavily on and map what we're doing closely to Cochrane's, what they call Pico ontology, which is for clinical studies. It's not for behaviour change, but it can be adapted for behaviour change and extended. And so Pico stands for what is the patient, the population, or the problem, and then what's the intervention, what's the comparator, and what's the outcome. And I think you can see already from what I've said so far that this captures quite a lot of what we're interested in, but it doesn't capture everything, and it won't capture it in the level of detail or with the kind of constructs that we're interested in. But we propose to work closely with Cochrane to develop that. So that's the beginnings of the ontology, and I'm now going to hand over to Mary, who's going to talk about how we're all going to do this working together as comrades and friends.